what I want to do today is to switch gears slightly. In the last couple lectures, we've been talking about the positive sense single-stranded RNA viruses. And again, going back to the Baltimore classification system, which really groups viruses based on the type of nucleic acid they had. The next grouping of viruses that I want to talk about are these negative sense single-stranded viruses. And they do things a little bit differently than the positive sense viruses, but in many ways, there's a lot of similarities because they both use single-stranded RNA. A reminder what negative sense means. It means that when the genome comes in, you need to make an intermediate copy or a piece of mRNA for that to be translated into protein. So the genome is negative sense, so you must make a positive sense copy of that RNA that can then be used to translate into protein. And just like for the positive sense viruses, I'm going to list you a whole range of viral families. These are animal viral families that fall within the negative sense viruses. And some we're going to talk about and others we aren't. But just so you get a sense for the families that fall within this, you have the rhabdo, the paramyxo, the orthomyxo, the bunya, the philo, the borna, and the arenoviridae. So these families all fall within this grouping, and what I'm going to do today is basically, in Monday's lecture, is to pull out a couple of members from these families and talk about them in some detail. And these are, I think, viruses that are important that cause human disease. And today, what I'm going to focus on are the orthomyxoviridae, and I think that will take the entire component of today's lecture. And then on Monday's lecture, I'll finish off and talk about some of the other viral families fairly quickly. So the orthomyxoviridae is a really, I think, important virus. It's a grouping. It's one that we hear news stories about all the time. Members of this group are the influenza viruses, so the viruses that cause flu. And we have traces or evidence of flu in humans dating back to at least 400 BC. I was just looking at the Peterborough Examiner today, and there was an article that the flu vaccination campaign in Peterborough is beginning. So you can now get a flu shot through your family doctor or family health team, and they'll be setting up clinics around Peterborough shortly. So it's the time for that annual flu shot. Again, it's one of those things that I think is a really important virus, and one that is a serious and significant health risk for humans. Now, every year there are a couple, I've got one or two here, but there's a couple of flu strains or particular types of flu that circulate regionally. And whether that region is pockets within Ontario or North America. But there are outbreaks of the disease, and they're usually caused by one or two strains of influenza in any given year. Okay, so these localized outbreaks are known as epidemics. Epidemics are regional outbreaks. A really good example of an epidemic was, if you think back to the SARS outbreak, we had clusters of cases in Toronto and Hong Kong and a few other cities, but it wasn't a global outbreak of SARS. Okay, that's what an epidemic is, a regional, localized outbreak of a disease. In contrast, a pandemic is a worldwide outbreak, and we had recently in 2009 an influenza virus pandemic where we had the H1N1 strain, which had crossed perhaps from pigs, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But that new strain of influenza was basically a global outbreak. So there's an outbreak across the world as opposed to a regional outbreak. And so there are periodic pandemics or worldwide outbreaks of influenza virus. Okay. Another good example of a pandemic virus would be human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. There are outbreaks of HIV around the world, so it's a pandemic virus. It's not a regional or localized outbreak of disease. So why is influenza spread so easily? There are a number of reasons. The primary one is that influenza virus is transported through respiratory route. Respiratory viruses seem to spread generally much more easily than do other forms of transmission of viruses. So some of the things that affect the spread of influenza, it has a short incubation period, so potentially within 24 hours of coming into contact with someone who's infected, you can start to show symptoms of the disease. So it can spread and infect someone fairly rapidly. Here's a nice little statistic. When you cough or sneeze, you're expelling 100,000 to 1 million viral particles, and those can go on to infect. People often showing symptoms of the flu don't stay at home. So you go to work, you go to school, and you're sneezing or coughing and spreading that virus to your colleagues. And this last one is sort of self-evident, and those of you that are taking immunology, you lack immunity to the circulating strain of influenza virus. And the influenza virus wouldn't be circulating if you had immunity to it. So if it was a virus that we had immunity to, it wouldn't be circulating. So it's kind of self-evident. There is a tendency for people to label all respiratory infections of the flu. I've got the flu. And people confuse the symptoms between the common cold and the flu. But there are some very distinct symptoms of the flu. And the common cold and the flu, actually, the symptoms aren't very similar when you get down to it. Some of the main symptoms that differentiate the flu from the cold is with a flu, you have a sudden onset or rapid onset of the disease. So literally, you can feel fine 1 minute, an hour or two later, you're running a high fever and you're laid out on your back and you're completely sick. Whereas a common cold has a slow onset. I don't know if you feel this way, but a lot of times when a common cold is coming on, you might sort of feel a little bit sick, and you kind of know that tomorrow you're going to have a full-blown cold. So maybe your sinuses feel a little weird, but it's a very slow progression from when you can sort of tell when a cold is coming on before the actual symptoms really start to appear. The flu is a sudden onset. One of the other things that differentiates it is a high fever. So the common cold is often not associated with a fever at all, and when there is a fever, it's usually a low-grade fever, say below 101 Fahrenheit, whereas the flu is associated with a fever of 101 to 104, so a very high elevated fever. So if you've just got a low-grade fever, you don't have the flu, you've probably got the cold. And finally, associated with the flu, we don't see things like a runny nose or a general cough. What you have is a dry cough and no runny nose associated with the flu. Okay. There are some other symptoms listed here, fever, malaise, headache. Those type of things are common when you have a fever and probably are side effects of that. Yep.
What's malaise?
You feel just tired. You just don't want to. And that's the other thing about the flu is that when you have the flu, and those of you that have had the flu recently, you are really laid out. It's difficult to get out of bed for a day or two. It's the fever, it's the side effects, some of the symptoms that are associated with the high fever. It's just really tough to operate. Whereas when you have a common cold, you just stuff your pockets with Kleenex and you come into class. Yeah? I'd say this table here also goes through it. A flu takes about 5 to 7 days to run its course. And I would say the common cold is not much different, probably 3 to 5 days. But colds can go on longer as well. But flus really hit you hard, and it's about a week before you're back to normal. But I don't think there's not a real significant difference in the time that you use to recover. Yeah?
With the flu infection, what specific mechanisms cause the body aches?
The body aches, if you recall back when we had that sort of little mini immunology lecture, those are part of the cytokines, your body's defenses, which they're doing a number of things, including elevating your body temperature. And the malaise or tired is just, your body just wants you to lie down somewhere so that you're not expending energy doing other things. The body wants the energy to fight the infection. And so those are being driven by cytokines, those type of symptoms. Okay, so it's important to realize that the cold and flu are very distinct in terms of symptoms. And again, sudden onset, high fever, dry cough really categorize a flu, whereas with the common cold, no fever to low-grade fever, and then you get things like runny nose and a more gradual onset of the disease or the infection. One of the problems, though, with the flu is that for those who have weakened immune systems, so perhaps the very young or the very old, the flu can lead to life-threatening secondary infections. And the most common is bacterial pneumonia. And one of the interesting things I think that people don't appreciate is that every year in Canada, somewhere around 4,000 or so people die from the flu each year. It's not actually the flu that kills you, it's generally these secondary infections. So the flu weakens your body's defenses, I'll talk a little bit about that later, which allows these other infections, like bacterial pneumonia, to take root in your lungs, and you often die from that. And again, I think, I've mentioned before that people don't really worry that much about the flu. I don't need a flu shot this year. But in a given year, there are probably more people in Canada that die of the flu than they do of breast cancer. So about 5,100 women each year die of breast cancer. Around 4,000 or so people die of the flu each year. So it's quite interesting, again, people's reactions and behaviors to diseases like this. So the influenza virus, or the orthomyxoviruses, are a single-stranded RNA negative sense genome. The viral particle is enveloped, and the genome is segmented. And this is the first time we've seen a segmented genome. What I mean by segmented is that the viruses that we've talked about so far, all their genetic materials on a single piece of nucleic acid. In the case of influenza virus, the genome is broken down into 8 pieces of RNA. So just like your genome is found on 23 pairs of chromosomes, the influenza virus genome is broken down into 8 individual pieces that each encode a particular protein or proteins. And that form of genome is known as a segmented genome when we're talking about viruses. Now, there are 3 different types of influenza virus. So there's influenza type A, B, and C. Influenza type C is not a real human health concern. It really only affects the really immunocompromised or those with really weak immune systems. So for most people, an influenza virus C infection would be asymptomatic. You often hear about influenza virus C outbreaks in things like seniors or residents or old age homes, where you have lots of immunocompromised people. And even in that group, the disease is relatively mild. The real health concern is influenza type A and influenza type B. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, influenza A and B. But right now, it's just important to realize that influenza type B produces epidemics of the flu, but not pandemics. Whereas influenza type A produces both epidemics and occasionally pandemics. So the pandemic strains of influenza are all type A. And I'll get to that in a little bit as well. Okay, so influenza type A and B are the real ones that we would consider when we have seasonal flu. And I'll talk about the vaccine.